Okay. Dr. Subbarao, how can we strategically link the Central Bank of Nepal and the Central Bank of India in between these two in advancing the financial sector of these two countries and in South Asia as a whole?
Well, that's a very large question with several dimensions. But first, let's talk about central banks.
Dr. Subbarao, the issue of Nepalese currency pegged with Indian currency is a matter of discussion for last several years. If we leave it open, do you think it will impact the Nepalese economy in a changed globalized context?
If you peg your currency to some other country's currency, you are outsourcing your monetary policy control to that central bank, right?
Dr. Subbarao, at present, Nepalese banking industry is facing liquidity crisis, lack of loanable fund. What should be the role of central bank in this phase, in this situation? What type of monetary instrument can use to ease it out for the loanable fund?
Well, you must say either demand for credit.
Yeah.
Okay. If there is demand for credit and banks are not having loanable funds, it means that the interest rate is not properly set. Let's forget about the NRB. Okay.
Hello sir, namaste.
Namaste Manoj, thank you.
Welcome to the program Banking Serophero.
Thank you.
Sir, we are very happy to have you here at Nepal. Once again, thank you so much for your time.
It's wonderful to be in Nepal, in this beautiful country, and I want to thank everybody for inviting me here. First time I've traveled outside India after COVID.
Oh,
Yeah,
that means it might be special one.
that's
This
special for me certainly.
Yeah. Sir, I would like to start the program with a COVID-related question. What do you think? What was the impact of COVID-19 in overall economy of South Asia, especially in banking sector? And did it create problems only, or does it create some opportunity as well?
See, the COVID crisis affected virtually every country in the world. Countries in South Asia were no exception. But it inflicted much greater damage on countries of South Asia because of our high poverty levels, high population density, low medical infrastructure. And you heard of this phrase, lives versus livelihoods. Every country had to confront this dilemma. If they tried to save lives by imposing a lockdown, they had to sacrifice livelihoods because people lost their earning opportunities. On the other hand, if they tried to protect livelihoods, they risked losing millions of lives. That dilemma was there for every country, but that dilemma was much more acute for countries in South Asia, as I said, because of our low levels of literacy, high poverty levels, high population density, and governments and central banks had to take very critical decisions about imposing lockdowns, about stabilizing the financial sector. And countries around South Asia did a lot of things to protect people from the COVID pandemic, but at the same time insulate the economy as much as possible from damage. You asked about opportunities. I would put it more like, what lessons do we learn from this crisis? Because as they say, no crisis should be wasted. So what lessons do we learn? The first lesson, of course, for all the countries in South Asia is to invest more in medical infrastructure, especially preventive care. Because pandemics are going to be more frequent, we've got to invest in medical infrastructure. Then I believe we have to create opportunities for people to earn, create more employment opportunities, protect the informal sector. You asked about the banking sector, right? So our banking sector should be strong enough to withstand crises and shocks like this. That's a difficult challenge, but I think that's something that we must pay greater attention to.
Sir, it seems that the economy is in revival phase. Can you just suggest the easiest way for revival in this phase?
Well, I wouldn't say easiest method for revival, because every country has to calibrate its policy depending on its situation with the pandemic as well as its economic situation. But hopefully, I think South Asia has suffered the second wave. I hope that we will not be hit by a third wave. They're talking about sero prevalence and the pandemic becoming endemic, which means that we have some natural immunity to it. I hope it becomes like that so that we can focus on a bigger issue, which is economic growth, employment and financial stability. But the short-term challenge for the governments and central banks, of course, is to withdraw from the easy monetary and fiscal policies of the crisis. Governments had borrowed quite a lot in order to protect people, give them livelihood support. Central banks had eased monetary policy, reduced interest rates, and injected enormous amounts of liquidity.
Yeah.
So the short-term challenge, both for the government and the central bank, is to withdraw these easy policies. But the medium-term challenge, I believe, will be to accelerate the growth rate. That's important. But what is even more important is to convert that growth into poverty reduction, employment opportunities, protecting people in the informal sector, improving skills, capacities, getting more investment. Those are the medium-term challenges.
Dr. Subbarao, which is more important, the role of central bank with its monetary and macroprudential policy, or the role of finance ministry with its fiscal policy in this phase?
Not just in this phase, but in every phase, both are important. It's like asking, is your right hand important or left hand important? We need both hands, and we need both hands to work in coordination, so that the human, just like the human body with two hands, an economy with the finance ministry and the central bank working, I would say, in coordination but not in complete consultation, is good for the economy. So I wouldn't put it like you've put it, finance ministry or central bank. I believe both are important, and I think there should be some consistency and coordination between the actions of the ministry and the government, so that together they support the economy.
Okay. Dr. Subbarao, how can we strategically link the Central Bank of Nepal and the Central Bank of India in between these two in advancing the financial sector of these two countries and in South Asia as a whole?
Well, that's a very large question with several dimensions. But first, let's talk about central banks. Central banks in South Asia are typically full-service central banks. They're monetary authorities, but they're also regulators of the banking or non-banking finance system. They're in charge of managing the external sector, exchange rates. They're in charge of payment systems, development policies. So there is need for coordination across all these services or functions of the central bank, in particular between NRB and the RBI, because the rupee, the Indian rupee, circulates in Nepal as a currency for payment systems. I think Nepal's monetary policy to some extent is circumscribed by the monetary policy of India and monetary policy as calibrated by the Reserve Bank of India.
Yeah.
Then there is the financial system, our banks. Our banks are interlinked as long as there is trade and investment relations between countries of South Asia. Our banks have to be interlinked. Our Indian banks have to come and operate in Nepal, and Nepal banks have to come and operate in India. Then about payment systems. I know millions of Nepalese work in India, and there are some Indian workers in Nepal, and people send money, right?
Yeah.
So we need to make sure that those payments are efficient and inexpensive. We need to learn from each other, because as much as there might be some innovation here in Nepal, there might be some innovation in Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, innovation in India, we must learn together. So I would think that one way of cooperation is training programs for staff of South Asian central banks under maybe SAARC umbrella. SAARC headquartered in Kathmandu actually.
Yeah.
Under SAARC umbrella there can be training programs for central banks of South Asia.
Okay. Dr. Subbarao, the issue of Nepalese currency pegged with Indian currency is a matter of discussion for last several years. If we leave it open, do you think it will impact the Nepalese economy in a changed globalized context?
I would think so. I'm not very familiar with the Nepalese economy's use of the Indian rupee, but from a general economic perspective, if you peg your currency to some other country's currency, you are outsourcing your monetary policy control to that central bank, right?
Yeah.
So if RBI tightens monetary policy or loosens monetary policy, that will have an impact on Nepal. But let's say hypothetically that Nepal's inflation is low, but India's inflation is high. If RBI tightens monetary policy, it is not optimal for Nepal, but your monetary policy gets tightened as well. So linking your currency to another currency means that you're surrendering your monetary policy sovereignty. But it has its advantages in the sense of some exchange rate stability. So people talk about this impossible trinity, right? That no economy can at the same time have a fixed exchange rate, an open capital account, and an independent monetary policy. Nepal has determined that to some extent it will cede monetary policy control by linking to Indian rupee. It has some advantages, but it also has disadvantages. I think Nepal going forward has to balance this. Nepal is a landlocked country, trading mostly with India. So I think link with rupee is important to your economy to some extent. But on the other hand, you want to diversify your exports, you want to diversify your investments, look beyond India. So how do you manage that is the challenge.
Dr. Subbarao, at present, Nepalese banking industry is facing liquidity crisis, lack of loanable fund. What should be the role of central bank in this phase, in this situation? What type of monetary instrument can use to ease it out for the loanable fund?
Well, I'm not very familiar with Nepal's NR-based monetary stance at the moment.
If you were the governor of India and India has faced the same problem, what you have?
Yeah, you're saying that banks are having a liquidity problem.
Yeah, lack of loanable fund.
Lack of loanable funds.
Loanable fund, yeah.
Okay, but the question is, that's the problem. But in order to think about the solution, you must say is there demand for credit.
Yeah.
Okay, if there is demand for credit and banks are not having loanable funds, it means that the interest rate is not properly set. Let's forget about the NRB. Okay, what it means is that if there is demand for credit and banks are not willing to lend, or unwilling to lend or unable to lend, it means that deposit rates are very high. Okay, so the supply is not meeting demand. Banks will have to reduce the interest rate at which they lend, so that credit for demand meets the supply for demand, which means that they have to reduce the deposit rates. Okay? And savers will lose, right? So it's got to be, for if the central bank is kept out of the equation, it is how banks manage their business. Reduce the interest rate so that the demand for credit is met by supply, but which means that they have to reduce the deposit rates. The other alternative, if banks are not having loanable funds, is for the NRB to provide liquidity, right? How does a central bank provide liquidity? By buying government bonds, right? And providing liquidity to the central bank. But again, that has its own problems of inflation. So the banking system and the NRB together have to determine what is the best solution for Nepal at the moment.
Dr. Subbarao, what do you think? Can India and Nepal create some innovative models with the help of monetary instrument for the financial stability of overall South Asia and in between these two countries? Because this is being realized that in both the countries, due to the unpredictable financial happenings, can we design those type of some innovative models?
Models how we can learn from each other, because financial stability has become a big challenge after the global financial crisis. One of the big lessons of the global financial crisis of 2008-9 is that even as central banks focus on growth and inflation, they cannot be sure that financial stability will be preserved. They have to keep looking at financial stability as an independent variable, as an independent objective. So central banks have to not only worry about inflation, not only worry about growth, they also have to worry about preserving financial stability. And earlier in the conversation, you talked about, Manoj, macroprudential instruments, monetary policy instruments. The big learning for central banks in South Asia and indeed around the world is when to use monetary policy, when to use macroprudential policy for preserving financial stability. And we have to innovate, like you said, which instrument is good at what time. So Nepal can learn from India, India can learn from Sri Lanka can learn from Bangladesh, because our economies are similar. We can learn from each other, but I think we also have to do combined, a joint capacity building.
Sir, what should be the role of central bank in the country like Nepal, the developing countries like Nepal, so that central bank will help to grow the economy overall?
Well, the role of the central bank, the primary role of the central bank is to maintain price stability. That is low and steady inflation. That is the fundamental objective of central banks everywhere, including NRB. But that goal is circumscribed by other objectives. You also have to support growth. You know, kind of like Bank of England, if you take the UK, they have an inflation target and their only undivided objective is to deliver on that inflation target. But in countries like ours, a central bank also has to worry about growth, employment. They have to worry about financial stability. So the role of the central bank, I would say, is to preserve price stability, is to support growth, and to preserve financial stability.
Okay, these three things.
Yes.
Okay. Dr. Subbarao, how can India and Nepal move jointly for attracting FDI, foreign direct investment in Nepal? Should Nepal change or reform something so that it can attract FDI easily?
Certainly. We've got to make investment happy proposition, a profitable proposition for investors. Nepal has to attract investors from India and from around the world. So you have to make doing business in Nepal attractive and comfortable for them. For that, as we discussed just now, the central bank has to maintain a stable economic environment, and the government has to make it, that fiscal policies, tax policies, investment policies, and governance, which is also very important. At the field level, how easily can they get permissions for land, labor, all other, how easy is it for them to get utilities, get all the clearances, fire, labor, factories, etc. So we have to focus on preserve or creating a conducive investment environment, and also on governance.
Dr. Subbarao, as you have a very vast experience in the financial sector, and you were the governor of India as well, what are the tips for the successful monetary policy? What makes the monetary policy successful?
It's not that simple, but I would say, I'm fond of saying this, as much as you must understand economics, the situation, you must be able to study the situation. You must be able to make a good judgment call. As I said, objectives of monetary policies, price stability, financial stability and growth, but sometimes, in fact most of the time, they are in conflict. So you have to make a judgment call on what is the more important objective at each point of time. But since you asked for one tip, I would say central bankers should keep their ear very close to the ground. Not just sit in their ivory towers and look at economic models and listen to commentary, but they must go and understand what's happening in the real world, what people feel about prices, what inflation expectations are, why some prices are moving more than others, what is the employment situation. So I would say that central bankers should keep their ears close to the ground in order to be making effective monetary policy.
Dr. Subbarao, in Nepal, it seems that there is a little bit misunderstanding between central bank and the economist journalism. Do you have anything to say regarding this?
I wouldn't say misunderstanding, but we were having a conference this morning. One of the topics that came up, a conference organized by NRB, which is how important it is for central banks to communicate effectively, which is when the governor takes a decision about interest rate or liquidity, he should be able to communicate the expected results of that decision. But as it happens in our countries, that decision or the communication of the central bank is sometimes misinterpreted. See, the responsibility of the media such as yours is to spread right information, to educate the public, that you interpret what the central bank has done for the larger public, because people don't understand, small shopkeepers, ordinary people, labor, they don't understand what is the implication of raising interest rate or reducing interest rate. So it is responsibility of the media to communicate that. But sometimes media fails to communicate effectively or misinterprets, either because they've not understood themselves or for some other reason. So I think it is important for the media to be educated as well. That's why we discussed in the morning that it is important for the central bank or an institution like BFIN, which has actually invited us for this conference tomorrow to Kathmandu, for them to hold some training programs for economic journalists, so that their understanding also improves and they're able to act as effective intermediaries between the central bank and the larger public.
Okay. Sir, at last, do you have anything to say to the viewers who are watching this interview?
I would say that Nepal is a great country, has a great future ahead. The government and the central bank, I'm sure, are working to accelerate growth and convert that growth to poverty reduction. I think people should also cooperate in helping the government and the central bank achieve their policies, in the sense that larger public understanding is important. They should also focus on capacity building. Not all the time, like John Kennedy said, is ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for the country. I think people should understand that they should ask themselves, what can I do for Nepal so that I can become a more responsible and useful citizen of Nepal.
Thank you so much for
Thank you, Manoj. You are a wonderful interviewer.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
हवस् त छिमेकी राष्ट्र भारतको केन्द्रीय बैंक रिजर्भ बैंक अफ इन्डियाका पूर्व गभर्नर डाक्टर डुभरी सुब्बाराव ज्यूसँगको साक्षात्कार सँगसँगै कार्यक्रम बैंकिङ सेरोफेरोको निर्धारित समय सकिएको छ। पुनः अर्को साता तपाईहरुको र हाम्रो भेटघाट हुने नै छ। तबसम्मको लागि म मनोज पौड्याल लगायत सम्पूर्ण बैंकिङ सेरोफेरो युनिटलाई बिदा दिनुहोस्। नमस्ते।
बैंकिङ सेरोफेरोका साथमा
नेपाल बैंक लिमिटेड, नेपालको पहिलो बैंक, पाइनियर बैंक विथ कम्प्लिट बैंकिङ सोल्युसन।
तपाईको आफ्नै बैंक, राष्ट्रिय वाणिज्य बैंक लिमिटेड, आफ्नो भनेको आफ्नै हुन्छ।
सबैको सुरक्षा एनएलजी को इच्छा, एनएलजी इन्स्योरेन्स कम्पनी लिमिटेड।
कृषि विकास बैंक, तपाई हाम्रो घर आँगनको बैंक।
न्यूनतम शुल्कमा अधिकतम आर्थिक सुरक्षा, रिलायबल नेपाल लाइफ इन्स्योरेन्स, सधैँभरिलाई।
उमेरमा कमाऊ जमाऊ,
बुढेसकालमा मजाले रमाऊ। सम्पूर्ण बैंक तथा वित्तीय समस्याको समाधान
बैंकिङ एन्ड फाइनान्सियल सोलुसन प्रणाली।
अर्थ राजनीति सम्बन्धी खास खबरका लागि अर्थराजनीति.com